The signal was already wrong by the time Verath heard it. She had been running sweep diagnostics on the Cathari listening post secondary array for the better part of 4 hours, cycling through bands that had not carried traffic in decades, when the console lit with a waveform she had never seen in 8 years of service. Not on the coalition frequencies, not on the Cathari military band, not on any recognized emergency channel in the catalog. The waveform was stuttered, compressed, folded over itself like something that had bounced too many times between too many surfaces before arriving here. And beneath the layers of distortion was a voice speaking words she could not understand in a language the system did not immediately recognize. Verath leaned forward in her chair, the vertebrae of her back cracking from 4 hours of immobility, her four-fingered hands already moving across the console to isolate the signal. The Cathari listening post was a 3-person station on the remote fringe of administrative space, an outpost so minor it did not even have a formal name in the Admiralty Registry. It carried only a numeric designation, Relay Station 1173. She was the communications officer, the senior watch officer, and on most days the only person awake during the long third shift that stretched from the station's artificial midnight to its artificial dawn. The 2 maintenance technicians who shared the post with her were asleep in the lower deck, as they always were at this hour, and the signal that was now painting her console in amber waveform lines had no business being on this frequency, in this sector, at this time. She pulled the waveform apart layer by layer, the way she had been trained at the Cathari Signals Academy 12 years ago. The original transmission was buried under 2 bounces. The first had come off a derelict navigation buoy in the Shen corridor, a shipping lane that had been closed after the Vorath crisis and never reopened. The second bounce had come off something else entirely, something whose transponder code her console could not immediately resolve. The origin point of the transmission was deep inside the Vorath exclusion zone, a region that the Cathari Admiralty had evacuated and sealed 6 cycles ago after a cascade instability in the system's primary star made the inner planets uninhabitable. Nothing was supposed to be in the Vorath zone. The navigational beacons had been pulled, the relay stations decommissioned, the JumpCom corridors shut down, the system declared a navigational hazard and removed from standard charts. But the signal was coming from inside it, and the voice beneath the distortion was not Cathari. Verath ran the language through the post-translation matrix, a system that could identify 643 known languages. It took 40 seconds to return a result, 35 seconds longer than any catalog species should have taken. The matrix flagged a partial match, low confidence, pulling from a language file updated only twice in the last decade. The language was Drevani. She sat back, both hands flat on the console edge, and let that settle. The Drevani were not a name that came up often in Cathari operations briefings. They were not a strategic concern. They were not an emerging threat. They were not a trade partner of significance. In 8 years at the listening post, Verath had encountered exactly 2 references to the Drevani, one in a coalition census report that listed their total population across all worlds, and one in a shipping advisory that noted their colony transports did not meet coalition minimum structural ratings for deep space transit. She had read neither document in full. There had been no reason to. The Drevani were a client species of the Hethari Compact, a minor polity 3 sectors rimward that administered colonial development for a handful of low-population worlds. They had no military fleet. They had no ships rated for deep space transit. Their vessels were short-range colony transports designed for ferry runs between their homeworld and 3 orbital stations. They had no reason to be in the Vorath exclusion zone, and they absolutely had no reason to be transmitting a signal that had ended up on Verath's console after bouncing off a dead buoy and an unidentified second surface. She played the partial translation. Reactor containment failure. 17 hours to breach. 412 souls aboard. Requesting immediate evacuation assistance from any Hethari compact vessel. Coordinates follow. Repeat, this is the Drevani colony transport Anishvara. We are adrift in the Voreth system, inner orbital ring. Reactor containment failure. Cascade accelerating. 17 hours to full breach at current degradation rate. 412 passengers, mostly civilian families from the Rishani colonial group. We do not have evacuation craft. We do not have functional escape pods. The pods were removed during the last refit to increase passenger capacity, requesting immediate assistance from any compact vessel. This message repeats. The message looped. Vereth checked the timestamp embedded in the carrier wave. The Drevani had been transmitting for 9 hours. That left 8 hours before the reactor breached. 8 hours for 412 people on a ship never built for the place it was stranded in, calling for help from a government 3 sectors away. She pulled up the Voreth exclusion zone boundaries on the secondary display. The zone was enormous, encompassing the entire inner system out to the 3rd orbital ring, a volume of space roughly 18 light hours across at its widest point. The Cathari Admiralty had sealed it after 3 precursor events in 4 cycles, had demonstrated that the system's primary star was entering a phase of instability that could, according to the astrophysics assessment Vereth had read during her certification program, produce radiation surges capable of sterilizing anything within the inner ring. The zone was supposed to be empty. The Drevani transport had no business being inside it, and the fact that it was there suggested either a catastrophic navigational error or a deliberate shortcut through sealed space by a captain who had gambled on the star staying quiet long enough to cross. Neither possibility was encouraging. She opened a channel to the Hethari Compact's Emergency Coordination Center. The channel returned a carrier signal, flat and dead, no handshake, no acknowledgement, no routing to a live operator. She tried again, same result. She tried the Compact's general hailing frequency. Nothing. She cycled through every compact frequency in her database, 14 channels in all, no response on any of them. She tried the Coalition's shared emergency relay, the multilateral channel every member polity was treaty-bound to monitor around the clock. The relay acknowledged her ping and returned a status report. 0 active responders within 3-hour transit range of the Voreth system. Vereth stared at the console. The amber waveform pulsed, the Drevani captain's voice cycling through the same plea every 90 seconds, and the entire emergency infrastructure of the Hethari Compact was returning dead air. 412 people drifting on a transport with a reactor eating itself, in a sealed zone nobody was monitoring, and their distress call had been beamed at a government that was not answering. The signal had not been aimed at Vereth, not at the Cathari. The Drevani had called their own protectorate government, the Hethari Compact. The bounce off the derelict buoy had sent it skidding across 3 empty sectors to Vereth's console, because she happened to be running diagnostics on bands nobody used. If she had been asleep, the signal would have passed through her buffer, been flagged as anomalous, and been purged at the end of the cycle. She would never have heard it. She ran the numbers. The nearest Cathari vessel with evacuation capacity was the patrol cruiser Solemn Reach, docked at Cathari Station 9 for a maintenance cycle. Time to undock, power up, and transit to Voreth, 11 hours, too slow. The nearest Coalition asset was an unmanned survey drone. Useless. There was nothing she could do. The math did not bend for good intentions, and 412 people were going to die in a sealed exclusion zone while their government returned static. Vereth almost closed the channel. Her hand was on the console, 2 fingers toward the kill switch. One motion from turning the signal off, returning her board to quiet static, letting the Anishvara die in silence because there was literally no one in range to help. Then she noticed the second bounce surface again, the one her system had failed to classify. She pulled the signal trace back up, enlarged the reflection analysis, and ran a comparison against every known transponder type in the extended archive. The second surface was not a buoy, not a derelict, not debris. It was an active transponder, broadcasting a low-power identification pulse on a frequency not used by any species in the Cathari coalition. She ran the code against the deep catalog. The archive search cycled through transponder registries from 12 species, cross-referencing power signatures, broadcast frequencies, and encoding standards that the Cathari had accumulated over 2 centuries of interstellar contact. Most of the entries were obsolete. Some referred to hardware that no longer existed, species that had gone silent, or infrastructure that had been scrapped during one of the Coalition's periodic consolidation programs. The match came back in 4 seconds. The transponder belonged to a human navigational relay. Earth designation, waypoint Kestrel 7, installed 216 standard years ago during an early human expansion program that had scattered navigational aids across dozens of minor corridors. It was supposed to have been decommissioned when the Shen corridor closed. No decommission order had been filed. The relay was still active, still powered, still listening on every band it had been built to monitor. And it had caught the Drevani distress signal on the second bounce. And it had, according to the relay's automated log that Verath was now reading with her hands locked on the console edge, forwarded the signal to the nearest registered human emergency responder. She read that line 3 times. The relay had forwarded the signal, automatically. Without authorization, without review, without a human operator deciding whether this was worth passing along. A 216-year-old navigation waypoint, forgotten by the species that built it, still running on its original power cells, had intercepted a Drevani distress call that had already bounced off a dead buoy in a closed lane, and forwarded it to a human ship, because the signal matched the acoustic profile of a general distress pattern. The relay did not know who the Drevani were. It did not know what the Hethari compact was. It had heard something that sounded like someone in trouble, and it had passed it along. That was its function. That was all it knew how to do. She checked the forwarding log. The recipient was listed as TCV 4412, a Terran Commonwealth vessel. No further classification in the Cathari database. No tonnage estimate, no armament profile, no crew complement, no operational history. She cross-referenced the designation against the Coalition's trade and military contact archive. Nothing. The humans maintained dozens of ship types with designation codes that the Coalition had never fully cataloged, and TCV 4412 was one of them. She did not know what it was, how big it was, what it was armed with, or whether it had the capacity to evacuate a single passenger, let alone 412. She opened a channel to the relay itself. It answered immediately with a flat automated tone, no personality, no intelligence, just a machine-generated status report in a human language she did not speak. The translation matrix took 6 seconds. The relay reported that the forwarded signal had been received and acknowledged by TCV 4412 approximately 4 hours ago. Receipt had been confirmed by a standard handshake protocol, a two-way exchange that proved the human ship had not only received the signal but had actively acknowledged it. The relay further reported, in the same machine-flat tone, that TCV 4412 had altered course upon acknowledgement. Toward the Verath system. Verath sat very still in her chair on a listening post that had just become the most important room in 3 sectors. She ran the relay's forwarding log again, looking for any sign of human oversight. There was none. No operator had authorized the forward. No command had been issued. The relay had matched the incoming signal against its distress pattern library, flagged it as a probable emergency transmission, identified the nearest registered human vessel, and forwarded the signal. The entire process from receipt to forwarding had taken 11 seconds. 11 seconds for a machine to do what the Hethari Compact's entire emergency infrastructure had failed to do in 9 hours. Nobody had contacted Earth. Nobody had included Earth. Nobody had informed Earth that a crisis was occurring in a sealed exclusion zone in Kethari sovereign space. The Drevani had called their own government. A derelict buoy had knocked the signal sideways. A forgotten relay had caught the ricochet. And now a human ship, type and capability unknown, was heading into a sealed exclusion zone to answer a call never meant for them, from a species they had likely never encountered, in a system the Kethari Admiralty had declared off-limits to all traffic. The humans had not been invited. They had not been consulted. They had not been given permission. A machine had heard a signal and a ship had changed course. That appeared to be the entire decision-making process. She pulled up the Voreth system on the tactical display. The exclusion zone was marked in red. The transport was a blinking amber dot near the unstable star, and at the far edge of the display, a new contact was resolving. A blue dot, moving fast, crossing the boundary without pause. TCV 4412. She could not hail it. The human vessel was on frequencies her console did not access. She could only watch. Vereth compiled the entire signal package and transmitted it to the Admiralty watch desk with a priority alpha flag. Then she opened a channel to the Solemn Reach. Solemn Reach, this is listening post 1173. I have a developing situation in the Vorath exclusion zone. 90 seconds of lag. Go ahead 1173. A Drevani transport, 412 souls, is adrift in the Voreth system with a reactor containment failure. Approximately 7 hours to breach. Their distress call went to the Hethari Compact. The Compact is not responding. Copy, we are 11 hours out. We cannot make that window. I know, there is a complication. A human vessel has intercepted the signal via an automated relay and altered course into the Voreth system. It is inside the exclusion zone now, closing on the transport. 4 seconds of silence. Repeat that 1173. A human vessel, Terran designation TCV 4412. It received the signal through a 200-year-old relay that caught it on a bounce and forwarded it automatically. The vessel is now inside Kethari sovereign space and approaching the transport. No human vessel has been authorized to enter the exclusion zone. I am aware of that, Solemn Reach. The human vessel does not appear to have asked. Another silence. Classification. Negative. Speed profile suggests a mid-range combatant. Stand by, 1173. We are expediting undocking and contacting the Admiralty. She stood by. She watched the blue dot cross deeper into the zone, decelerating now, adjusting its approach. Then it stopped. Not gradually. A hard arrest from transit velocity to zero relative motion in seconds. The kind of stop that should have pulped a crew against the forward bulkhead. The human ship arrived alongside the transport and held station at less than 200 meters. Then a new signal appeared on her console. Broadband, high power, deliberately wide spectrum, the kind of transmission designed to be heard by anyone with a receiver within range. On the Drevani emergency frequency, which the human ship should not have known existed and certainly should not have been able to broadcast on. Machine translated Drevani. Drevani vessel Anishvara, this is Terran corvette Voss, hull designation TCV 4412. We received your distress signal via relay. We are alongside. Confirm your status. A corvette, 1 ship, 31 crew, not a rescue ship, not a hospital ship, not a transport with evacuation bays and mass population life support. A small warship designed for patrol work and light combat, with quarters for 31 and cargo capacity sufficient for routine supply runs. The transport answered. A live voice, female, shaking. Terran vessel, this is Captain Rishani of the Anishvara. Reactor containment is accelerating. We now estimate 6 hours to breach, 412 passengers, 83 children, no evacuation craft, no functional escape pods. A breath across 3 sectors. We did not call you, we called the Hethari Compact. We do not understand how you received our signal. The human voice came back, flat, unhurried. Copy Anishvara, your signal bounced through a relay of ours. We heard you anyway, stand by for docking. We heard you anyway. As though hearing someone was the same thing as being obligated to answer. As though the distinction between being called and overhearing did not exist in human operating procedure. Vereth opened a new log file. The corvette docked with the Drevani transport in 4 minutes. 4 minutes for 2 ships from different species, different engineering traditions, different docking port configurations to achieve hard contact. The corvette transmitted a standard docking protocol. The Drevani transport's computer rejected it, returning an incompatibility flag. The corvette transmitted a second protocol, rejected. A third, simplified further, rejected again. Vereth was watching this unfold on the signal traffic and beginning to calculate how long it would take to establish a compatible handshake when the corvette did something she had not anticipated. It abandoned its own protocols entirely, dropped to a basic electromagnetic clamp interface, the lowest common denominator docking method that any vessel with metal hull plating and a functioning airlock could accept, and transmitted a single command that amounted to open your outer door. The Drevani transport's docking clamps, which had been designed to work with Hethari compact standardized ports, recognized the electromagnetic signature and engaged. Contact. The corvette's crew did not wait for the docking seal to finish its pressure equalization cycle. According to the signal traffic, they opened their side of the airlock within 30 seconds of clamp engagement, running a portable atmospheric sensor across the gap to verify the seal manually rather than waiting for the automated systems to complete their diagnostic. Someone on the human crew said something that the translation matrix rendered as good enough, and the first human crew member crossed into the Drevani transport's docking vestibule. Then the corvette began transmitting data to the transport's bridge. Crew manifests, medical questionnaires, an atmospheric compatibility assessment, and a detailed evacuation plan, all in machine-translated Drevani that was rough at the edges but functional. The plan was methodical, organized, and built around one central problem that the corvette's crew had clearly assessed within minutes of arrival. A corvette designed for 31 people could not carry 412. The plan addressed this with an honesty that Vereth found striking. It did not pretend the problem was smaller than it was. It did not promise resources that did not exist. It stated the corvette's internal capacity, 200 passengers maximum if every non-essential compartment was stripped and cleared, and then it proposed a solution for the remaining 212 that Vereth had to read 3 times, checking the translation at each pass, because she was not sure she was understanding it correctly. The corvette would detach its forward cargo module, a structural component of the ship's own hull, seal it with emergency pressure barriers, outfit it with portable life support units pulled from the corvette's emergency stores, and tow it behind the ship on reinforced cables as a pressurized evacuation pod. The plan noted, in a parenthetical that the translation matrix rendered flatly, that the cargo module detachment would reduce the corvette's structural integrity by approximately 18% and would require the crew to seal off the forward access corridor with emergency bulkheads. The crew had already begun the detachment procedure. They were not waiting for approval from the Drevani captain or from anyone else. They were cutting their own ship apart for strangers, for people they had never met, from a species they had never served alongside, in response to a signal that had reached them by accident. She forwarded this to the solemn reach. Confirm, 1173. The human corvette is modifying its own hull during an active rescue. Confirmed. Forward cargo module being detached for passenger use. Structural rating of that configuration. Unknown. Human engineering standards. This is irregular. Yes, solemn reach. The first group transferred 30 minutes after docking. All 83 children accompanied by parents and guardians. The corvette's crew had not merely vacated their quarters, they had remade them. Bunks were stripped, mattresses removed and stored, emergency padding laid down in their place. Personal items had been cleared from every surface and stowed in bags that Vereth later learned the crew had stuffed into the torpedo magazine, the one space on the ship that nobody needed during a rescue operation. The children were given the crew quarters, the warmest and most comfortable spaces on the vessel. The crew moved to the engineering crawlways and the maintenance access tunnels between decks. One crew member cleared out a supply closet that measured, by Vereth's later calculations, approximately 2 meters by 1 meter, and set up a sleeping roll inside it. The internal traffic noted this without comment, except for a single message from another crew member that the translation matrix rendered as, "Save me the one next to the coolant pipe. It's warmer." The second group, 109 passengers including the elderly and those with medical conditions, transferred over the next 90 minutes. The process was slower because each passenger required medical screening before boarding, and the corvette's medical officer, a single doctor working alone in a facility designed for routine injuries to a crew of 31, was now running triage on Drevani patients with conditions she had never treated, using equipment calibrated for a species she had never examined. The doctor's name, Vereth would learn later, was Akanjo. She had been the corvette's sole medical officer for 3 years. She had treated broken bones, radiation burns, and one memorable case of a crew member who had gotten his hand stuck in a maintenance hatch. She had never treated a Drevani patient. She had never seen Drevani physiology up close. She was consulting the corvette's database in real time, pulling up comparative anatomy files that had been compiled from academic surveys rather than clinical experience, and she was using them to calculate dosage conversions for medications that had been formulated for human tissue. 12 passengers arrived with respiratory distress from low-level radiation exposure aboard the transport. The doctor assessed them, ran blood oxygen equivalents through her portable scanner, and determined that all 12 needed antiradiation treatment. She had no Drevani-compatible medication. She had human antiradiation agents that targeted cellular repair pathways in human tissue. Captain, 12 patients with rad-induced respiratory compromise. I've cross-referenced our antiradiation agents against the Drevani metabolic profile in the database. The binding efficacy looks like 60%, maybe 65%. That's enough to slow the cellular damage significantly, but not eliminate it. Side effects are unpredictable. I'm working with one data point from a 30-year-old academic paper, requesting permission to administer off-label. Improvise, Doc. Copy. Improvising. The doctor treated 12 Drevani patients with human medication, adjusting each dosage individually based on body mass, metabolic rate estimates, and respiratory function readings from her portable scanner. She ran out of beds in the medical bay after the 8th patient. She moved the remaining 4 into the corridor, laying equipment tarps on the deck plates as improvised patient surfaces. She fashioned IV stands from engineering scaffolding poles that the damage control team had provided, lashing them to the corridor railings with cargo straps. She modified portable oxygen units, designed for human respiratory requirements, by removing the intake filters and replacing them with adapters cut from engine gasket material. The engineering crew provided the gaskets within 10 minutes of being asked, along with 3 different sizes of flexible tubing, a roll of pressure-rated tape, and a handwritten note in human script that the translation matrix could only partially render. The legible portion read, "Rated for a lot worse than breathing." One of the Drevani patients, an elderly male with advanced respiratory distress, went into a secondary reaction 40 minutes after treatment. His oxygen absorption spiked, then dropped. The doctor adjusted his dosage twice, recalibrated his oxygen mix, and spent 20 minutes monitoring his breathing manually, one hand on the portable scanner and the other resting on the patient's chest to feel the rhythm. He stabilized. The doctor moved on to the next patient without pausing. During the second transfer, the reactor worsened. The cascade went nonlinear. 6 hours became 5, then 4, each measurement worse than the last. The containment field was degrading in a pattern that Captain Rishani's engineering team had never seen before, the crystalline structure of the emitter coils breaking down from the inside, each failure accelerating the next. The corvette commander opened a channel to the transport's bridge. Her voice maintained its flat, methodical cadence. "Anishvara, Vas Actual, your containment curve is steepening beyond revised models. Current rate puts breach at 4 hours. I am sending my damage control team to your reactor compartment. They are not trained on Drevani systems, but they are trained on containment physics. The principles transfer." Captain Rishani's voice cracked. "Terran vessel, your people will be exposed to radiation levels already beyond safe limits for our species. You are risking your crew for people who are not your responsibility. We did not ask for this." 2 seconds of silence. "Your government didn't answer, Captain. We did. My team is crossing now." 7 crew members crossed to the transport with portable containment equipment. Field patches, bypass couplings, portable generators, shielding panels designed for human reactor geometry. Chief Maru, the team leader, transmitted a running assessment. "Vas Actual, Chief Maru, in the reactor compartment, 6 emitters in hexagonal array. 4 with microfractures in the housing, 2 with crystalline degradation in the coils. Those are the ones driving the cascade. The hex pattern containment is different from our spherical geometry, but the physics is identical. We can patch this." "How long, Chief?" 90 minutes to flatten the curve, 3 extra hours." "You have 60. Then I'll work faster." They did not try to adapt their equipment to the alien emitters. They bypassed the housings entirely, running field stabilization energy through the structural frame of the reactor chamber itself, using the metal walls as a secondary containment surface. They welded portable generators to bulkheads, ran power cables through access panels never designed for human equipment, and improvised junction points from spare hull plating, dismantled ventilation ducting, and a Drevani toolbox that happened to be the right alloy. One of the Drevani engineers, a senior technician who had spent his career maintaining these reactors, stood watching the human teamwork with an expression that the signal traffic could not capture, but that Verath imagined clearly. He asked Chief Maru how he knew the chamber walls would conduct the containment field properly, since they had not been designed for that purpose, and the alloy composition was unknown to the human team. Maru's response, logged with the timestamp 14:47:12, "I didn't know." But the alternative was not trying, and that alternative had a worse outcome. The Drevani engineer then pointed out that 2 of the bulkhead panels near the reactor's base were a different alloy, installed during a refit, and might not conduct the field at the same rate as the original walls. Maru checked them, found the engineer was right, and had 2 members of his team reinforce those panels with additional portable generators. The Drevani engineer provided his own tools for the mounting. They worked side by side for 9 minutes, 2 species who had never been in the same room before, communicating through gestures and a shared understanding of what a containment field needed to look like on a graph. In 47 minutes, the containment degradation curve flattened. The reactor was still failing, the crystalline damage to the emitter coils was permanent, but the pace had dropped from catastrophic to manageable. Meru's improvisations had bought approximately 3 additional hours. 3 hours that had not existed 20 minutes ago. Voss Actual Chief Meru. Containment curve is holding at new baseline. The secondary field through the chamber walls is stable. Estimate 3 hours before the bulkhead conductivity starts degrading under the thermal load and we're back where we started. The clock is running, Captain. Get the rest of those people off this ship. Verath noted the timestamp. 47 minutes. She had once read a Cathari Engineering Corps report on emergency containment field repairs aboard Cathari naval vessels. The fastest documented repair of a comparable containment failure by a trained Cathari team, working on their own equipment, with their own tools on systems they had maintained for years, had taken 2 hours and 14 minutes. Meru's team had done it in 47 minutes, in an alien reactor, with human equipment, on a system they had never seen before. She saved the timestamp to her personal log without annotation. Some numbers did not require commentary. While the damage control team held their position at the reactor, the third group of passengers began transferring to the tow pod. The converted cargo module's atmosphere was calibrated for human respiration, higher oxygen content, different pressure than Drevani standard. The first passengers reported dizziness and difficulty breathing. The corvette's environmental systems officer began adjusting the mix remotely, but the portable life support units had limited calibration range. The chief engineer, Holt, crossed to the tow pod herself, opened the life support units, and manually bypassed their calibration limiters, extending the atmospheric adjustment range beyond design specifications. Then she linked the pod's air supply to the corvette's main environmental system through the tow cable conduit, routing atmosphere through a data cable housing that had never been designed to carry it. She tested it by breathing the output herself, then adjusted the mix until it matched Drevani standard within 2%. It held, the passengers could breathe. By the 4th hour, 340 passengers were off the transport. The corvette was operating at 13 times its design population density, 70 civilians in crew quarters, 80 in the wardroom and galley, 40 in the cargo holds, 10 medical patients in corridors outside the med bay, 212 in the tow pod, breathing through a repurposed data cable. The crew of 31 had distributed themselves across the remaining spaces. Bridge crew on station. Engineering in rotating shifts, monitoring the overloaded environmental system, the structural stress at the hull section where the module had been removed, and the tow pod's improvised life support. The rest were in crawlways, access tunnels, and one supply closet, whose occupant had described it as an upgrade from my last apartment. The remaining 72 people on the transport were crew members and civilian volunteers who had stayed to assist with the final evacuation sweep. Captain Rishani was coordinating from her bridge, sending teams through every compartment, every emergency shelter, every maintenance crawlspace where someone might have hidden or been left behind. The sweep turned up 3 individuals, an elderly passenger who had been asleep in a secondary storage bay and had not heard the evacuation announcement, a young mother with an infant who had been too frightened to move from her quarters, and a maintenance worker who had been in the ventilation system, repairing an air handler when the evacuation began, and had not been able to find his way back to the main corridors. Human crew members escorted all 3 to the docking port. The maintenance worker had to be guided through the corvette's own ventilation access, because the main corridors were now full of patients on equipment tarps. Then the star pulsed. Verath saw it from 3 sectors away, a spike in the Voreth primary, not the full cascade failure, a precursor event. Ambient radiation in the inner orbital ring jumped by a factor of 6 in 2 minutes. It hit both ships simultaneously. The 7 human crew members in the reactor compartment were now absorbing radiation at levels that exceeded not just their mission limits but their career limits. The corvette commander did not raise her voice. Anishvara, we are reading the spike. Ambient levels have exceeded safe parameters for both species. Your remaining people need to be off that ship in 20 minutes. All of them. No exceptions. 3 of my engineers are still in the reactor compartment with your team. My people are bringing them out. Prep for final departure. Chief Meru's voice, barely reaching Verath's console through the interference. Vas, Chief Meru. Got the 3 Drevani engineers. 2 ambulatory. 1 down, acute radiation sickness, can't stand. Kaori and Tanaka carrying him, moving through the access corridor. Levels in here are bad. Move, Chief. Meru's dosimeter alarmed. A sharp chirp. He silenced it. 30 seconds later, a higher priority alarm. He silenced that too. Chief, your dosimeter is flagging. I noticed, Captain. 90 meters from the port. Kaori flagging too. Tanaka next. We are not stopping. They did not stop. The last 72 crossed in 18 minutes. The human damage control team came last, moving through corridors where the radiation levels were now climbing faster than their dosimeters could reset between readings. They were carrying 2 Drevani engineers who had collapsed in the access corridor, one over each shoulder of a human crew member named Kaori, whose dosimeter had been alarming continuously for the last 4 minutes, and who had stopped silencing it because there was no point. The 3rd Drevani engineer managed to walk with support from another human crew member, but collapsed at the docking port and had to be caught and carried across the threshold. Meru came through the airlock last. He manually cycled the hatch seal behind him, checking the pressure indicator twice to make sure the seal was solid before he stepped away from the door. His movements were careful, deliberate, the movements of a man who understood that his body had absorbed something it would be paying for. His dosimeter was silent, not because the radiation had stopped, because he had disabled the alarm entirely somewhere in the reactor compartment, apparently deciding that the noise was a distraction from the work. The corvette detached from the Anishvara. The docking clamps released. The airlock separated. The corvette's engines engaged at 112% of rated thrust, a level that the ship's engineering manual listed as emergency maximum, sustained operation not recommended beyond 30 minutes. The corvette would need to sustain it for considerably longer than 30 minutes to clear the inner system and reach the relative safety of the exclusion zone's outer boundary. The tow pod held formation behind the ship, connected by cables that were simultaneously carrying structural load, electrical power, and pressurized atmosphere through conduits that had been repurposed from data transmission lines. The cables had been rated for data. They were now carrying the air that 212 people were breathing. 412 Drevani civilians were alive. All of them on a single Terran corvette that had been designed for 31. Pulling away from a dying star in a sealed exclusion zone, crewed by people who had cut their own ship apart and walked into a failing alien reactor, and silenced their dosimeter alarms, and carried unconscious engineers through irradiated corridors. All because a 200-year-old relay had forwarded a signal that was never meant for them. Verath forwarded the complete log to the Admiralty. Then she forwarded it to the Solemn Reach. Then she sat in her chair on a listening post that was 3 sectors away from the crisis and utterly helpless to affect its outcome, and she watched. The transit was not simple. Behind the corvette, the tow pod held formation on cables that had been rated for data transmission and were now carrying structural load, electrical power, and the pressurized atmosphere that 212 people were breathing. The engineering officer, Holt, was monitoring those cables from the corvette's engineering station, running continuous stress calculations on conduits that had no published stress ratings because nobody had ever intended to stress them. 40 minutes into the transit, the star pulsed again. A secondary precursor event, smaller than the first but sustained, a rolling increase in ambient radiation that climbed for 6 minutes before plateauing at a level that made Verath's display shift from amber to red. The corvette was still inside the inner orbital ring. The tow pod's improvised shielding, which consisted of the cargo module's standard hull plating and nothing else, was absorbing radiation at rates that would begin degrading the portable life support units within 2 hours. The corvette's commander opened a ship-wide channel. Vereth heard it clearly. All hands VOS actual, radiation spike sustained. We are increasing to 118% thrust. Engineering, I need the forward hull plates reoriented to maximize shielding for the tow pod. Use whatever you have. Holt's voice came back, clipped. Captain, if I reorient the forward plates, I lose structural compensation for the missing cargo module. The hull section, where we detached, is already flexing under the thrust load. How long before it becomes a problem? At 118%, 90 minutes, maybe less. We clear the inner ring in 70. Do it. Copy. Holt and her team were physically rearranging hull plating on a ship under thrust, repositioning structural panels to create a radiation shadow for the tow pod behind them. The corvette was flying at emergency speed with a piece of itself missing, towing 212 people on data cables, its crew rearranging the hull from the inside, while the star behind them continued to pulse. The structural integrity warnings were audible on the channel, a low repeating tone that nobody acknowledged and nobody silenced, because acknowledging it would have required someone to stop working. Inside the corvette, the ship's environmental system had been designed to scrub atmosphere for 31. It was now processing atmosphere for over 400. The carbon dioxide levels were climbing. Not dangerously, not yet, but steadily, in the way that steady things become dangerous when they are given enough time. A junior environmental specialist named Wen had been making adjustments to the scrubbers every 4 minutes for the past 2 hours. Each adjustment bought another 4 minutes. The transit to the exclusion zone boundary would take 3 hours. The margin was sufficient. It was not comfortable. In the crew quarters, now occupied by 83 Drevani children and their parents, one of the human crew members had found a way to project images on the bulkhead wall using a portable maintenance display unit designed for viewing engineering schematics. She had not been ordered to do this. She had looked at the children, some crying, some silent with the particular silence of children who were too frightened to cry, and she had decided that what this situation needed was something to look at that was not frightening. She loaded the only non-technical visual files she could find in the ship's entertainment database, which turned out to be Earth landscape photographs from the crew's personal collection. Mountains, oceans, forests. Sunsets in colors the Drevani had never seen on their own world. The crying slowed. Some of the children moved closer to the images. One of them pointed at a photograph of a coastline and said a word that the translation matrix could not resolve, but that the human crew member seemed to understand anyway, because she nodded and found more photographs of water. Dr. Akanjo had not slept. She was running on stimulants from the medical kit, which she had noted in her own log were intended for combat scenarios and were not recommended for sustained medical practice because they impaired fine motor control after the 4th hour. She was in her 5th hour. She had sent a request to the engineering team for more gaskets to fashion breathing adapters. The engineering team, who were simultaneously monitoring the overloaded environmental system, the structural stress on the hull, and the tow pod's life support, sent 6 gaskets, 3 sizes of flexible tubing, and a note that read, "If you need more, just yell. We're right next door, sort of." They were not right next door. They were 2 decks below, in an engineering compartment running at 41 degrees, because the thermal management system could not dissipate the heat generated by over 400 bodies in a space designed for 31. The transit took 3 hours and 14 minutes. In that time, the corvette sustained 118% thrust for 71 minutes, processed 6 full atmosphere cycles for the internal population, pumped continuous atmosphere to the tow pod through data cable conduits, weathered 2 secondary radiation pulses from the Voreth primary, and managed a brief crisis when one of the tow cables showed a microfracture in the conduit wall that threatened to vent the pod's atmosphere into space. Holt patched it from inside the corvette, reaching through an access panel with a sealant applicator designed for pipe joints and applying it to a cable sheath at the junction point where the cable exited the hull. The patch held. She did not mention that she had been leaning out of an access panel into a section of the ship that had no atmospheric containment, held in place by one of her team members gripping her legs, applying sealant to a cable she could barely reach while the ship shook under emergency thrust. The repair took 90 seconds. She went back to monitoring the scrubbers. When the corvette crossed the exclusion zone boundary, the radiation levels dropped to background normal within 20 minutes. The corvette dropped to standard thrust. The structural warning stopped. The tow cables held. The corvette's commander opened a channel to the passengers. All passengers, this is VOS Actual. We have cleared the Voreth exclusion zone. Radiation levels are at background normal. We are holding station at the zone boundary and awaiting the arrival of the Cathari patrol cruiser Solemn Reach. Current conditions aboard the VOS are stable. Medical bay is open for anyone who needs it. We'll keep the lights on. Captain Rishani's voice came back over the channel, and for the first time since Vereth had heard her speak, the shaking was gone. "Voss, this is Rishani. Understood. On behalf of 412 passengers and crew of the Anishvara, we acknowledge your assistance." A pause. Then the commander's voice, carrying a tone that Vereth had not heard before, something warmer than the flat operational cadence, but only just. "Copy, Anishvara. Get some rest. The hard part's over." It was not entirely accurate. The corvette was still carrying 13 times its design population, running on overloaded environmental systems, missing a section of its hull, towing a cargo module full of people on data cables, and crewed by 31 personnel who had not slept in over 12 hours, several of whom were carrying radiation exposure that would require medical intervention. But the statement served its purpose. The hard part, the part where people might die, was over. Everything else was logistics. Verath sat in her chair on a listening post 3 sectors away, and did something she could not explain later in her official report. She opened a channel to Waypoint Kestrel 7, the 216-year-old human navigational relay that had started this entire chain of events by doing the one thing it had been built to do. The relay answered with its flat automated tone. No intelligence, no awareness, no capacity to understand what it had set in motion. A machine doing its job for 2 centuries because its builders had put it there and then walked away, and the machine had never received instructions to stop. Vereth said, in standard Cathari, knowing the relay could not understand her language, could not understand the concept of gratitude, could not understand that it had saved 412 lives by performing an 11-second automated signal forward. "Thank you." The relay pinged an acknowledgement, a standard automated response to any incoming transmission, the electronic equivalent of a reflexive nod. It meant nothing, but Vereth sat with the acknowledgement for a long moment, listening to the silence that followed it, and she thought about what it meant to build something that kept working after you forgot about it. The Solemn Reach arrived at the Voreth system 4 hours later. The exclusion zone was bathed in elevated radiation from the stellar precursor event, the reading still climbing slowly, the star still settling after its shudder. The Drevani transport Anishvara was drifting, dark, powerless, its reactor having breached 90 minutes after the last person evacuated. The breach had ruptured the lower 3 decks of the ship, venting atmosphere, and sending the vessel into a slow tumble that the Solemn Reach's sensors tracked with clinical precision. If anyone had still been aboard, they would have been dead within seconds of the breach. The timing margin between the last evacuation and the reactor failure was 107 minutes. Without the human damage control team's intervention, that margin would have been negative. The corvette Voss was holding station at the system's outer edge, engines at idle, running on minimal power to conserve fuel and reduce heat output aboard a ship that was now generating 13 times its designed thermal load from body heat alone. 412 Drevani civilians alive. The solemn Reach's captain hailed the corvette. Verath heard the exchange from 3 sectors away and recorded every word. Terran vessel Voss, this is Cathari patrol cruiser Solemn Reach. We are on station to receive the Drevani evacuees and to provide any required assistance. On behalf of the Cathari Admiralty, we acknowledge your actions in this matter. Solemn Reach, this is Voss Actual. We appreciate you getting here, ready to begin passenger transfer at your convenience. Recommend you prioritize the medical cases coming off our med bay. My doctor has been working with off-spec medication for 7 hours, and running on what I'm told is her 4th cup of something she made from the emergency ration packs. She would appreciate a real hospital to hand her patients to. Voss, understood. Before we begin transfer, for our formal record, how did you receive the Drevani distress signal? It was transmitted on Hethari compact internal emergency frequencies. Those frequencies are not monitored by Terran systems, as far as our records show. It bounced, Solemn Reach. The signal hit a derelict buoy in the Shen corridor, bounced off one of our old navigation relays in the same corridor, and the relay forwarded it to us. Standard relay protocol. The relay did not know the signal was on compact frequencies. It just heard a distress pattern and sent it to the nearest ship. Your relay forwarded a foreign distress signal to your vessel automatically, without human authorization. A pause, not hesitation, not discomfort, more like someone realizing the question was genuine, that the Cathari captain was asking because he truly did not understand, and needing a moment to figure out how to explain something that, from the human perspective, apparently did not require explanation. That is what our relays do, Solemn Reach. They hear a distress signal, they forward it. That is what they are for. Verath saved that exchange to a separate file. She labeled it with a timestamp and a note that read, in her own shorthand, Design Philosophy. She would replay it dozens of times in the weeks that followed, always pausing at the same 6 words. That is what they are for. Not a boast, not a justification. A flat statement of engineering philosophy delivered in the same tone as a maintenance diagnostic readout. The fact that their relays have been doing it for 200 years without anyone checking on them is not a bug. It is the design. The transfer of passengers from the corvette to the Solemn Reach took 8 hours. Each passenger required medical reassessment, atmospheric reacclimatization, and registration in the Cathari evacuee database. The human medical officer, Akanjo, personally briefed the Solemn Reach's chief medical officer on every one of her patients, providing handwritten notes on each individual's treatment history, medication dosages, and reactions. The notes were in human script with Drevani phonetic annotations that she had apparently learned during the 7 hours of treatment. 0 patients had been lost. All 12 of the radiation exposure patients were stable and recovering. Captain Rishani was among the last to cross. She stood at the docking port between the corvette and the Cathari cruiser, and she paused there, one hand on the human airlock frame, and said something to the corvette's commander that Verath's console barely caught, thinned by 3 sectors of distance and degraded by the Vorath system's residual radiation interference. I will tell my people what you did. I will tell them that we called for help and the wrong ship answered, and the wrong ship was the right one. The commander's response was 2 words. The translation matrix could not resolve them with confidence. The best guess was something equivalent to take care or safe travels, but the matrix flagged a low confidence score. The tone, however, was unmistakable. The same flat, measured cadence it had carried throughout the entire operation. The cadence of someone for whom rescuing 412 people from an alien species, while cutting your own ship apart and sending your crew into an irradiated reactor was the kind of thing you acknowledged with a nod and 2 words, and then moved on from, because there would be another signal tomorrow, and the relays were still listening. In the weeks that followed, Verath learned several things. She learned that the Hethari Compact's Emergency Coordination Center had been offline during the entire crisis, because of an administrative disagreement between 2 of the Compact's ministries over the allocation of funding for the Emergency Relay Network's annual servicing contract. The network had been shut down for a 72-hour operational review period that was, in practice, a bureaucratic pressure tactic. During that window, the Drevani colony transport Anishvara had experienced a reactor containment failure, transmitted a distress signal for 9 hours, and received no response. The transport had been screaming into a channel that had been deliberately, knowingly, administratively turned off by the government it was calling. She learned that the corvette's crew had not debated whether to respond. According to the Voss's own operational log, which the Kethari diplomatic office obtained through formal channels 3 weeks after the incident, the commander had received the forwarded distress signal, verified its contents, checked the relay's provenance, and ordered a course change to the Voreth system within 4 minutes. No vote had been taken. No consultation with higher command had been requested. The fact that the distress call had not been meant for her ship, had not been transmitted on human frequencies, had been aimed at a government she had no relationship with, and would require her to enter Kethari's sovereign space without authorization did not appear in the decision log. It had apparently not been considered a factor. She learned that, when the Solemn Reach's engineering team inspected the towpod after the passenger transfer, they rated its structural integrity above Kethari's standard emergency pod specifications. The atmospheric routing through the data cable conduit, which Holt had improvised on the spot, had maintained consistent pressure throughout the 7-hour tow. Built in a crisis, under radiation with improvised tools, by a crew of 31. Better than what the Kethari had built in a dedicated shipyard, with full resources and unlimited time. She learned that all 7 damage control volunteers had known the radiation levels before they crossed to the transport. The corvette's commander had asked for volunteers rather than issuing an order. All 7 had stepped forward within seconds. The remaining 24 crew members who had not been selected filed formal grievance requests, citing their exclusion from the reactor mission as a professional slight. She learned that Chief Maru's post-mission medical assessment showed radiation exposure at 4.3 times his career-safe limit. He and 2 other members of the damage control team, Cowrie and a specialist named Devon, were placed on extended medical leave and transferred to a Terran medical facility for monitoring and treatment. Maru's mission report was 4 lines long. The first 3 described the technical specifications of the containment field stabilization procedure. The 4th line read, "Containment held long enough, everybody got out. Good day." She learned that the medical officer, Dr. Akanjo, had lost 0 patients. The Solemn Reach's chief medical officer, after reviewing Akanjo's treatment records, filed a formal commendation noting that the human doctor had achieved clinical outcomes with improvised tools and cross-species medication that met or exceeded standard of care results with proper equipment. She learned that a Drevani girl, approximately 6 standard years old, had been found during the evacuation asleep in a human crew member's bunk, wrapped in the crew member's personal jacket, holding a small object that turned out to be a human emergency ration bar that the crew member had given her. The crew member, a junior technician named Solari, had not mentioned this in any report. Verath learned about it because Captain Rishani included it in her own account, submitted to the Drevani Colonial Affairs Office, as evidence of what she described in formal administrative language as the character of those who answered our call. Verath filed her own report with the Kethari Admiralty. 47 pages. The Admiralty responded 4 days later with a formal acknowledgement, a commendation for Verath's monitoring and reporting, and a carefully worded diplomatic note indicating that the Cathari Foreign Office would be contacting Earth's Colonial Affairs Bureau regarding the unauthorized entry of a Terran military vessel into the Vorath exclusion zone. She thought about 412 people calling a government that had turned off its phone, about a crew that gave away their quarters, cut their ship apart, walked into an alien reactor, silenced their alarms, and carried strangers through radiation because those strangers could not walk. She filed the diplomatic note without comment. She did, however, attach to it the full signal log from waypoint Kestrel 7, including the 11-second forwarding sequence, the 4-minute course change decision, and the complete operational timeline of the corvette Voss from signal receipt to final evacuation. She attached these as supporting documentation. The diplomatic note went into the Foreign Affairs queue. The signal logs went into the permanent archive, where anyone who wanted to understand what had happened in the Vorath system would find not the diplomatic language of governments managing an incident, but the raw data of a crew that had heard a signal and answered it. 3 weeks later, the Compact's network came back online. The Drevani Colonial Office sent a formal inquiry asking how a human vessel had arrived first, carrying an undertone of irritation that someone else had done its job. The Admiralty forwarded the question to Verath. She wrote 3 lines. The Drevani distress signal bounced off a derelict buoy in the Shen corridor. The bounce carried it to a human navigation relay, waypoint Kestrel 7, which automatically forwarded it to the nearest human vessel. The human vessel answered. She did not add the part she was thinking. She did not write, "The Drevani called you." You did not answer. Earth was never on the call list. Earth's forgotten relay heard it anyway. Earth sent a corvette with 31 crew. The corvette's crew cut their ship apart and walked into a failing alien reactor for people they had never met, from a species they had barely heard of, in response to a signal that was never meant for them. And when they were asked how they received the signal, they said, "That is what our relays do." She did not write, "That is apparently also what they do." She filed the response and went back to her console. Somewhere in the Shen corridor, 216 standard years old and counting, waypoint Kestrel 7 was still powered, still listening, still forwarding anything that matched the acoustic signature of a distress call. It would continue to do so for approximately another 400 years, according to engineering specifications filed under legacy infrastructure, decommission pending. The decommission had been pending for 200 years. The relay did not appear to have noticed. Nobody had asked it to listen. Nobody had maintained it. Nobody had checked on it. Nobody had sent a technician to inspect its power cells or update its firmware or verify that its distress pattern library was current. It had been built, installed, activated, and forgotten. And it had spent 216 years doing the only thing it knew how to do, in the dark, in a closed corridor, alone, forwarding signals to ships that might or might not still exist, because that was its function and nobody had told it to stop. It listened anyway. Verath opened the old bands on her console, the ones nobody monitored, the ones that carried nothing but static and dead echoes from closed shipping lanes and abandoned corridors. If another signal bounced through, off a dead buoy, off a forgotten relay, off some piece of infrastructure that a species had built and left running because that was what they did, she wanted to hear it. Not because it was in her orders, because she had learned what happened when somebody else heard it first. The morning watch was quiet. The bands were empty. She left them open. And somewhere in the dark between sectors, patient and unhurried and exactly as old as the day it was built, the relay kept listening,